February 1914. The group of 17 people ventured forward, picking their way across the Arctic ice. About 6 feet below the crew's feet, the frigid water of the Arctic Ocean jostled. In front of them lay a sight to behold. Jagged, dramatic hills of ice jutted 100 feet in the air, the product of sea ice and coastal ice pack smashing into each other and deforming like tectonic plates. Beyond that, far out of sight, a real mountain loomed in the fog, some 30 miles away. The crew could only hope that they could make it there and try to survive a bit longer. But even then, they would have a long, long way home. This dramatic picture isn't from any adventure novel, but from a real-life event in world history. By the late 18 and early 1900s, much of the world had been explored, with the exception of 2 places: the poles. Cold and desolate, the Arctic and Antarctic are some of the last places on Earth that adventurers hadn't set foot in, and for the last generations of explorers, these places were like magnets. The North and South Poles had been discovered by Robert Peary and Roald Amundsen, respectively, but some discoveries had yet to be made. This was especially important in the Arctic since various countries actually had territory in the far north, and mapping these areas out was key to finding land claims, as well as the potential discovery of resources. Past mere practicality, the Arctic was home to various indigenous peoples, and in a golden age of anthropology, learning about these people, including their language and how they adapted to such inhospitable conditions, was very important. Additionally, there were many animals that lived up north that weren't well known, and learning more about them could help shed a light on the Darwinian process. Plus, the clout that came along with discovering something new was very tempting for scientists and explorers alike. It was in this environment that 2 men's paths crossed, a meeting that would lead to disaster and triumph. Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at the story of the CGS Karluk and its crew. I got this idea from Buddy Levy's book Empire of Ice and Stone, which talks about the last voyage of the Karluk and the amazing story of the crew. But on YouTube there isn't that much media about it, so I figured I would try to fill the gap and tell the story here as well. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on X and Instagram and all that, and let's just get back into the story. The fate of the Karluk and its crew fundamentally rests in the hands of 2 men, Vilhjalmur Stefansson and Robert Bartlett. Stefansson was a Canadian-born, Midwest American-raised man who always had a sense of adventure. Enamored by his Scandinavian heritage, he changed his name from William to the Icelandic Vilhjalmur, even changing the spelling of his last name. An educated man and a Harvard graduate, he had first ventured to the Arctic for archaeological work in college, and had been hooked ever since. Energetic, silver-tongued, and ambitious, he decided to strike out on his own, leading an expedition to a part of the Arctic yet undiscovered. Working with the Canadian government, Stefansson got the go-ahead in 1913 and scrambled to get the supplies and a crew needed for the expedition only a few months away. He was just 33 at the time. The other, older man, Robert Bartlett, a Newfoundlander, came on later in the process. Bartlett was a seasoned navigator and Arctic explorer, famously being on the 1909 expedition that discovered the North Pole, although he had actually been asked by the expedition leader to turn back before he personally reached the pole. Experienced and craving adventure, Bartlett leapt at the opportunity to captain Stefansson's ship, the CGS Karluk. But Bartlett wasn't Stefansson's first choice. Another captain, C.T. Pedersen, had initially been chosen but had actually resigned, leaving Stefansson to appoint Bartlett. The expedition was set to start in Esquimalt, Canada, right above Seattle, where it would move north and explore the West Arctic coast of Canada above Alaska. The aims were twofold and would be carried out by 2 main parties of ships. The first aim was to explore and discover any new land in the area north of Alaska, which hadn't been fully explored yet, claiming it for Canada. They would sail in the summer and try to make it to land or freeze into ice packs in the winter, riding them north as they drifted. The second aim was to conduct anthropological and zoological studies in those new lands, learning about the people and animals that lived there, hoping to discover a rumored blonde Eskimo people believed to be descendants of the early Viking expeditions to North America. To this end, Stefansson had hired the largest scientific group of men ever brought to the Arctic, who would be split between the two parties. For today's video, we'll just be focusing on that first party, or the northern party, which was just one ship, the Karluk. While the southern expedition was supposed to follow behind and conduct most of the research, the Karluk was supposed to be the trailblazer, leading the way in discovering new lands. The Canadian government ship CGS Karluk was a steamer ship that had been bought by Stefansson at a bargain price and then sold to the Canadian government for the expedition. It was a brigantine steamship with 2 masts as well as a 150 horsepower steam engine with a screw propeller, giving the ship 2 methods of movement. Built in 1884, the Karluk, which means fish in the Alutiiq indigenous language, was somewhat dated by the time of the expedition, having run its last voyage in 1911, hence the low price. While its hull had been reinforced by ironwood and its 129-foot length made it big enough for the voyage and the crew's supplies, its weak engine concerned Bartlett. At 150 horsepower, it was far less than a dedicated Arctic ship, which could have as much as 1,000 horsepower. Plus, its hull shape was not designed to be encased in ice, which was a commonplace practice for Arctic ship exploration at the time to not lose progress. Its hull was a conventional shape, which made it a fine ship, but when surrounded by ice, it would sit too deep in the water and start to get crushed by ice pack. A better design for Arctic ships was to have a flatter hull with many supporting trusses, which kept the ship higher out of the water and strengthened the cross-section, making it able to survive the high pressures. There were other problems too. Because the preparation was so rushed, Stefansson had split the important gear and rations and even the scientists between the two parties, the northern and southern party, making it difficult for either to be self-sustainable or even fully conduct research. But Stefansson wasn't too worried. In his experience in the Arctic, he had generally been close to land and had interacted heavily with local groups. He was married to the idea that the Arctic actually was very hospitable so long as people followed the local customs, and he hoped that he could prove this by bringing along so many scientists who weren't hardened explorers and keeping them well-fed and happy in the far north. He even brought a video crew to document his successes. Bartlett, by contrast, was a more hardcore explorer and had experienced firsthand the horror stories of Arctic exploration, being stranded there on the SS Roosevelt for months and running out of rations, resorting to eating hide-based clothing to survive. But it was too late to make those adjustments now. On June 17, 1913, the Karluk, along with its southern partnerships, the Alaska and Mary Sachs, left Esquimalt and moved along the Pacific coast. Bartlett knew that this expedition was too late in the year, and that they would only have a couple months before ice pack would set in and stop their progress. Stefansson, ever the optimist, and perhaps somewhat naive, didn't heed these concerns, and the Karluk steamed onwards, picking up some new crewmates, including a friend of Stefansson's and a few Inuit for hunting and caretaking. Moving along the North Alaskan coast through early August, the seas began to freeze. Hoping to push ahead to the harbor at Henderson Island for the winter, Bartlett had a decision to make. He could either hug the coast, making it very likely they would be iced in, kinda hundreds of miles away from any help, or he could move north where the ice was thinner in the open ocean and try to push on to Henderson. He chose the latter option, but by August 13th, they were stuck. The ice closed in around them, and the engine was too weak to try and break the ship out of the ice flow. The ice extended too far to try and use dynamite to get back into open water, and the crew had to wait and hope that the ice flow would break up on its own. Instead, the flow actually began to move them west. Over the course of the next month, they were moved about 100 miles back the way they came, although fortunately they didn't stray too far from shore. By mid-September, the ice flow had stopped again, and it was here that Stefansson had an idea. In order to try to get fresh meat, which was important to prevent scurvy, he elected to lead a hunting party to the mainland in search of caribou. Taking another 5 men, including the cameraman, Stefansson set out on September 20th, even though he knew caribou were all but extinct in the area. To this day, speculation abounds as to what Stefansson was thinking, with many on the Karluk believing that he was actually trying to abandon them. The next day, a blizzard hit and the ice flow began to move again, much faster this time. By the time Stefansson tried to find the ship again, the Karluk had moved dozens of miles. Deciding to cut his losses, he made it to the mainland and got in contact with the Canadians, who were not very happy, and his southern party, reporting the Karluk missing and likely gone. As far as the world was concerned, the 25 people on the Karluk were dead. But that's not what actually happened. Bartlett and the Karluk continued to drift further west for almost 2 weeks. On October 3rd, things got really bad. The flow they were stuck in started to move north, totally isolating the Karluk from any hope of rescue until next summer. By October, they actually had moved off of the continental shelf, which, while not practically any worse than before, just served as a scary reminder of the depths below, over 1,000 fathoms. Surprisingly, the crew of the Karluk did okay. Bartlett had learned in his time aboard ships that the key to keeping up morale was keeping busy. Boredom made people irritable, even insane sometimes, and moderate physical work kept people in shape and sharp. Using a dredge, James Murray, one of the scientists, was able to do some work from examining bottom-feeding creatures in the region, sometimes even discovering new species. Some of the men, especially Bjarne Mammon, were experienced skiers and used the time to teach others the skill in case they ever had to make a break for land. The sled dogs aboard often proved a challenge, but some animals were the light of the journey. Molly, one of the sled dogs, was friendly, and after a scare where she was separated from the others by a floating iceberg, was miraculously able to find her way home the next day. A small black kitten, which they named Nijirarak, had snuck aboard in Alaska, and the crew grew fond of her, especially Helen and Mugpi, the Inuit daughters of Karluk and his wife, who had been brought along to help with sewing and mending on the journey. Karluk and Kadaktovik, another Inuit brought along for his hunting prowess, were very successful in finding fresh meat, including seals and polar bears to keep the crew from the monotonous diet. The men also played games. At one point, they made a ski jump, leading to days of laughter and excitement, as well as some minor injuries. Most importantly, on Christmas Day, the crew and scientists competed in an Olympic Games they set up, including a 3-legged race, sprints, long jump, tug-of-war, and wrestling. Here, Bartlett actually asked Mammon, the skier, to abstain from most of the events so as to spread the wealth of success, to which he happily obliged. The natural beauty of their surroundings, especially the northern lights, amazed the men. They needed all the uplifting they could get, since after November 11th, they weren't able to see the sun for months. But the crew still had issues. Despite what they hoped, no one was looking for them, and even if they were, there was no way to reach the Karluk until much later in the year. While morale was doing better than expected, it wasn't perfect. One scientist, George Malek, had begun to act strangely, sleeping above decks in the negative 40-degree weather at night to prove a point that no one had ever argued to him, and he even violently shook one of the smaller crewmates and screamed at him for no good reason. Eventually, by December, the Karluk had drifted within sight of land, which Bartlett correctly assumed to be Wrangel Island, off the northern coast of Siberia. While this was good news, it caused tension when Bartlett didn't seem to immediately formulate a plan to approach the island on foot, causing some of the scientists, including Alistair Mackay, the ship's doctor, to quietly consider a mutiny, enlisting other men to their cause. Things got worse on January 10th when the ship began to leak. The ice was putting immense pressure on the ship, and it was only a matter of time before she was crushed. Improvising, Bartlett ordered most of the supplies on the ship moved off to another camp nearby on the ice. He had already been doing this for weeks, and while this risked the supplies if the ice floe broke apart, it would also save the supplies if the ship did go under, and more urgently, it lightened the ship, making it rise in the water and reducing the sideways pressure on it. This worked at least for a time. These developments, in addition to bad weather, made the mutinous men delay their plans, deciding to stick with Bartlett, at least for a while. Horrendous boom sounded through the ship, and the timbers of the hull cracked under the ice pressure. The Karluk was going down, and the crew had to scramble in the dark to recover whatever supplies were left on board. After 20 hours, the ship went down, with Bartlett dramatically standing on the railing of the ship until it went below the water, stepping off in stride onto the ice as it sunk below the waves. Due to Bartlett's foresight, most of the supplies, including the food, some stoves, and the dogs and sleds, were saved. To protect themselves, the crew built igloos and for the most part fared relatively well, but they couldn't stay there forever. Bartlett had to make a plan to get his men and their supplies to land before the spring weather made the ice too dangerous. Shipwreck Camp, as they would call it, was still about 80 miles north of Wrangel Island. Not knowing what lay ahead, Bartlett appointed a 6-man scouting party to chart a course to the island, which left on January 21st, 1914. But as they approached land, they realized something was wrong. There was miles of open water and floating ice, making the land inaccessible. Deciding to split up, 2 men, including Mammon, headed back to Shipwreck Camp, while the remaining 4 men decided to wait for an ice bridge to form and make landfall. Mammon returned on February 3rd and relayed what he had seen. However, it was quickly determined that the land the party found was actually nearby Henderson Island, much smaller than Wrangel, with no mountains and little chance of food or driftwood. To make matters worse, McKay and 3 other men announced their intention to leave. Not being able to stop them, Bartlett gave them some supplies for their attempt to find land on their own. Despite being warned of the dangers, the men continued anyway. After a week with no word from the advance party, Bartlett had Mammon and others form a sort of rescue party hoping to find the lost men. Mammon, however, suffered a knee injury on the journey and had to turn back with another, but the rest of the party continued on. Making it near Herald Island, they observed the open water again and determined that the lost party must have continued to Wrangel Island or, gruesomely, fallen through the ice. On the return journey, the party noticed that ice cracks were starting to get bigger and bigger, forcing them to take many detours to get to the camp. It was also at this time that the men saw the mutinous party, who were struggling along the ice, looking very, very bad. Despite begging them to come back to camp, the mutineers trudged along and decided to leave themselves to their fate. Ultimately, they are thought to have fallen through the ice. With the ice becoming less stable with the return of the sun, Bartlett had the men begin to trailblaze the way towards the island, bringing supplies to cache as they went. On February 19th, he split the Karluk survivors into 4 groups and set the first 2 off. At one point in the journey, the men encountered polar bears. Seeing the first circling the camp, they shot it and went to tell the other, only to come back outside the igloo and see yet another bear, which they also shot. Not long after, a 3rd bear approached them, which they shot as well, giving a good haul of meat, but terrible anxiety for the rest of the night. It's around now that we get to where we were at the start of the video. Wrangel Island off in the distance, out of sight, while the Karluk's men searched the pressure ridges for passes to cross through, hacking their way through where they could, and using 2 sleds tied together as counterweights to pull one up as the other's descent down the backside of the ridge was slowed. The journey over the ridges took 12 days, but miraculously they all made it to shore. Celebrating and jumping for joy at their encounter with terra firma for the first time in months, the survivors still had some unsettling things to deal with. For one, that first search party was never found, and enough time had passed that their likelihood of survival was slim. As it turned out, the party had somehow made it to Herald Island, but were left stranded when their ice path had broken up. They died there on the island, likely from starvation or hypothermia, and their remains were only discovered years later in 1924. But they had bigger issues than lost friends. Much of the food had to be left behind at shipwreck camp since they couldn't transport it, so retrieval parties would have to be sent back to ensure they had enough food for the summer. An initial party was sent back, but after reaching the sea ice past the pressure ridges, they saw open water with no safe path to shipwreck camp. Most importantly, a rescue team had to be assembled. This team would have to cross the sea to Siberia, then move overland all the way back to Alaska, where they would have to get help and bring a ship back to Wrangel Island, all before the ice closed up again the next fall, leaving them stranded for another year and almost certainly dead. Bartlett, being the captain, decided to go on the rescue mission. He would keep the party small, only bringing the Inuit Kadektovik with him. Before he left, he sent out one more party of 3 to try and get food back from shipwreck camp. He also ordered the survivors to split up into smaller camps around the island, increasing the area that they would be able to hunt in, while hopefully separating the men who were starting to feud. They were to be under the control of John Monroe, and they were to share their food. By July, when a rescue would be most likely, they were to move to Rogers Harbor on the south of the island, where the rescue ship would look for them. On March 18th, Bartlett and Kadektovik set off, first searching the east and southern shores of Wrangel Island to see if they could find either of those 2 lost parties. With no luck, they struck south to Siberia. The situation on Wrangel Island deteriorated quickly. Monroe had trouble keeping the men in check, and injuries from the ice journey left many men unable to move or work. At the same time, the expedition to get more food from shipwreck camp ran into the same issue it did before. Open sea kept them from getting back to camp, forcing them to turn back to the island. On the way back, Ernest Chafe, along with the dog Molly and a sled, stepped over a chasm in the ice when the iceberg broke away, separating him from the rest of the party. Fearing him dead after trying to find him, they returned back to camp. Chafe anxiously waited for his iceberg to get close to another ice floe, and he was eventually able to get back on solid ice, even though he was completely lost. Abandoning the sled, Chafe was near death, but Molly tugged him along for over 30 miles, finding her way back home and saving his life. Meanwhile, Bartlett and Kadektovik moved across the sea and made it to Siberia in just 17 days. Not long after making landfall, they found natives who welcomed them in, giving food and warmth. This was not what Kadektovik had expected, as he had always learned in Alaska that Siberian natives would actually try to kill him if they ever saw him. Continuing on, the pair hopped from village to village until Bartlett found someone that spoke some English. Finally coming into contact with the Russians at Emmatown, he was able to get more guidance on his route. Not sure if he should try to make it to a harbor and get to Alaska himself, or just try sending a telegram, he was eventually told by the Russian official Baron Kleist that his best course of action was to go to Emma Harbor, 100 miles away, and try to hail a ship there. Bartlett and Kadektovik had covered 700 miles in 37 days, mostly on foot. Here, Kadektovik requested to remain and return home himself, which Bartlett obliged, thanking him profusely for all he had done. Amazingly, when he got to Emma Harbor, he learned of the presence of Captain Pedersen, the captain of the Karluk before him, and he gladly gave him a ride back to Alaska. But once he was back, he was forced to wait. After successfully using a military telegram to get a message out requesting a rescue to be sent to Wrangel Island, he had to sit patiently for positive hearback. It was the summer of 1914, and World War I had just started. The best ships for the rescue, which were Russian, were redirected for the war, forcing Bartlett to wait for American or Canadian crews to come to his area. Most frustratingly, Bartlett had actually been on a US Navy ship and had pled his case to the captain, who was very sympathetic, but he wasn't able to redirect to Wrangel Island without proper say-so, and so he had to patrol the Arctic waters while Bartlett's men wilted. Plus, it was one of the worst winter in years, and would probably be much later in the year than expected before they could even make it to Wrangel Island. Back on the island, things were getting bad fast. After his miraculous return, Chafe had to have his toes amputated. Lacking the doctor, the job had to be done without anesthesia and with blunt clippers. He wasn't the only one, but he was spared the worst fate. On the southern side of the island, Mammon, Malik, and the cook, Robert Templeton, had all camped at Rogers Harbor, where the first rescue was expected. The men, like most everyone else on the island, had little luck hunting, and sickness began to affect them, likely the result of their pemmican rations going bad. As morale ebbed, their sickness wore on, and fresh food was absent, things decayed. On May 17th, Malik died in his sleep. The others, too weak to bury him, left him there until William McKinley, who had dangerously traveled alone, came to check on them. In a bid to get fresh food to Mammon, who was also desperately sick, McKinley trudged back to his main camp and back, getting snow blindness in the process. Sadly, when he returned, the young man was dead, only 21 years old. Templeman, the only survivor, was too weak to move, and McKinley, who didn't have supplies to sustain anyone there, turned back, promising to return to the terrified man, now left with 2 corpses. At this point, the main camps were out of food. Birds had come to the island, but a chronic lack of ammunition meant that they were hard to catch, and besides, there wasn't that much food in each of the birds anyway. Seals and polar bears weren't too common on the island either, and the arrival of walruses served as their last hope. However, these massive beasts were incredibly dangerous to hunt and required many shots to kill. All hope seemed lost, especially as some of the men began to steal food. Tempers flared, and Monroe and Fred Maurer went south to Templeman as arguments over food began to rage. One night, a shot rang out. Rushing to the shelter, it was discovered that George Breddy, one of the thievery suspects, had been shot in the face. To this day, it is debated exactly what happened. At the time, the official story was that he had done this himself, either on purpose or on accident, but some men believed that he had actually been murdered by one of his tent mates. But even with one less mouth to feed, the survivors were barely hanging on, and even the Inuit woman with them, who had been extremely resilient this whole time, began to show signs of distress. Finally, on July 13th, Bartlett's request was answered. The USS Bear, the Navy ship we talked about earlier, came by to St. Michael, Alaska to pick him up as they steamed ahead to Wrangel Island. But due to the ice and the other obligations of the Bear, they weren't even able to get close to the island for over a month. When they did head to Wrangel, the Bear was stopped by ice 20 miles away. Defeated, Bartlett had to accompany the Bear all the way back to Nome. But while he was there, he encountered another ship, the King and Winge, which was headed to Siberia. Pleading with the captain, Bartlett got another chance at the rescue. Back at Rogers Harbor, the 3 men thought they heard something out in the distance in the early morning of September 7th. At first thinking it was just ice, they ignored it, but they heard the sound again. It was a ship's whistle. They were saved. Signaling for help, the men were spotted and greeted by a shore party where they were told of the other survivors to the north. Steaming that direction, the King and Winge came in sight of the other survivors that afternoon. Kirilluk, who was out hunting, had sprinted across the ice to intercept the ship, while the others hollered and waved. They were found, and the survivors were rescued from the island and reunited with Bartlett. The rescue mission, strangely enough, had taken aboard the video camera crew that had left with Stefansson months before, and they were able to record the end of the ordeal, staging a shot where the survivors were being helped along by rescuers despite being able to actually walk on their own power. In total, 11 men had died. The 4 men in the mutiny party died, likely falling through the ice. Second mate Anderson and the 3 men with him died as well after being stranded on Herald Island. On Wrangel Island, Malik and Mammon died from sickness, and Bredy, the last to die, suffered from his mysterious gunshot wound. After the expedition, most of the survivors went their separate ways. The Inuit crew members returned home, while some of the survivors went home and stayed well away from the Arctic. Stefansson, for his part, took responsibility for the disaster, but was fully able to continue his exploration afterwards. It's still not fully settled exactly what Stefansson was thinking when he left the Karluk. Personally, I think he was just a bit of a sociopath. I don't think he was trying to escape the ship per se, but I think he didn't really care and was getting upset they weren't making any progress and was totally fine with just starting over with a new slate, because he was totally aware that the ship could move at any minute, and he left anyway. But that's just me. Bartlett also continued exploring the Arctic, eventually helping the US in the World Wars, and dying soon after in 1946. Of the 14 survivors, some had more dramatic trajectories. Hauntingly, Fred Maurer, one of the first men rescued at Rogers Harbor, was convinced by Stefansson in 1921 to return to Wrangel Island to colonize it for Canada, even though it already belonged to the USSR. After a year and a half and Stefansson's failure to send help for a year, he ultimately died there trying to escape from the island like Bartlett had years before. The last survivor of the Karluk, Mugpi Ipaluk, was just a little girl for the ordeal. She lived until 2008 to the age of 97. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you like this type of thing and I'll make more of them. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that fun stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.